Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where people are joining us from. And thank you very much for joining this discussion that we are about to have. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. We do have the Q&A and the chat function going, so please do use that to provide and engage with us throughout the discussion today. We are also on Twitter, if you'd like to join the conversation over there using hashtag Walking Towards Justice. My name is Heidi Simon. I'm the Deputy Director here at America Walks, and I want to take a moment to welcome you to the 4th episode of our Walking Towards Justice series. As many of you know, America Walks launched the Walking Towards Justice series about 1 year ago to help spark conversations and reflective thinking about the racial and social justice precedents and current day conditions that shape the communities we are living and working in today. We believe it is only through these honest conversations that we can find the common ground for working together to create healthy, active places for everyone. To that end, we have discussed the role of federal policy in promoting segregation, how mass incarceration has destroyed communities and fueled distrust between communities, law enforcement, and the justice system. We have explored street harassment and how we create safe public spaces for women and members of the LGBTQ inclusive community. We have heard from so many of you telling us that the series has done what we had hoped, to spark broad conversations in your workplaces, neighborhoods, and communities, and for that we are grateful. Today we are going to explore why walking champions, walkable community advocates, and disability rights advocates should form alliances and develop a shared effort to deepen our understanding and create better inclusion and equity in all of our communities. There is much more that I could say about this esteemed panel, but I don't want to take up too much time. What I do want to do is introduce Karen Korb, our guest moderator and key developer of this panel, a great friend of America Walks. Karen is Lakeshore Foundation's Policy and Public Affairs Coordinator. She holds an undergraduate degree in Public Administration from Kean University and a Master's of Sports Management from Georgia State University. Karen is deeply passionate about inclusion of persons with disability at every level of sport and life. She is a 2-time Paralympian and has served on the USOC USP Athletes Advisory Council for the past 8 years, representing 7 sports. Karen has and does hold many posts related to sports diplomacy and has traveled the world promoting inclusive sports programs. Her career in both advocacy and policy has spanned over 2 decades, and she has always had her eye on the pulse of humanity and how she can best collaborate, convene, and represent the intentional actions of inclusivity. So I'm going to hand it over to Karen.
Heidi, thank you so much. We really appreciate everyone who's on this panel and everyone who could join us today, especially those at Lakeshore. I want to give a big shout out to everybody who's in the Syncton room right now. Thank you, Lisa Hilborn, for making that happen. Super appreciate you. And of course, my director, Amy Raworth, and of course, the executive director of America Walks, Kate Kraft. I'm sorry you couldn't be with us today, but we will have many more to come. So I'm going to give you a little format about what we're going to do. We have this amazing, very intersectional panel today that we put a lot of thought and a lot of effort into this. We've been working on this since March, if you can believe that. And what we're going to do is we're going to run through some questions, and our panelists are going to run through some answers, and then we're going to leave some time at the end of this webinar so our audience or whoever wishes to pose a question or make some comments, feel free to. There is an opportunity on screen, or you can call in, or whatever that looks like for you. Please feel free to contact us. Also, we will provide all the social media contacts for our panel, what they've given us, at the end of the webinar, and you'll also be able to look at America Walks, their site, and that information will be available for you as well, so you can contact them directly. So here's the big question. Why are we even doing this? Like, why do we have to have a panel around people with disabilities in public spaces where everyone else in the world seems to be able to access these public spaces? You know, most people don't even think about going out into these public spaces. You know, and our aim generally is to create awareness and connections with the disabled population, not for, but with. There's a difference. And throughout this entire webinar, I will use identity first language, and I will also use person first language. Here at Lakeshore Foundation, we use person first language. I know that I'm very prideful about my disability, so I will use identity first language when I'm outside of these four walls. So I encourage the entire panel to use whatever you would like to use, what you are most comfortable with that represents you. We're having a bigger discussion, to encourage people within the community to think about their walkable spaces. What does it look like outside of your home, or what does it look like outside of your work? What does it look like outside in your community that you are able to access every single day, and that people with disabilities may have to think about a little bit differently in terms of their access and their inclusion? So what I'm going to do now is, I know that each of you on this panel has an incredibly powerful history. And I would like you to introduce yourselves. Let's just start, take about 2 or 3 minutes. Let's start with Judy. Judy Human in the house. Oh, let's unmute you. Hold on a second. Can we do that, Heidi? Or unmute yourself. Wait, Judy, can you unmute yourself?
Yes.
There you go.
Well, I just want to briefly say, and we'll get into talking more about it in a minute, but the term spaces and accessible spaces is really very different today than when I was growing up. So who I am, I'm the oldest, I think, on this panel. I was born in 1947 and I had polio in 1949. And I've seen tremendous changes over the 70 years. My experiences when I was growing up were, very briefly, basically nothing was accessible. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, yay Brooklyn. But yay Brooklyn, New York, it still had a lot of inaccessibility, still does, but it's much, much better. But it went beyond just the issue of the physical space. It was the absence of disability. So my mother took me to school and was told I couldn't go to that school because it was not accessible. And the Board of Education sent a teacher to my house for 2.5 hours a week until I was in the middle of the 4th grade. And so for me, what I have experienced in my life is parents learning to become advocates in order for them to be able to help ensure that I could live a life that they somewhat envisioned. They were immigrants from Germany. And I learned over time that it was important for me to become an advocate for myself. And for me, one of the critical issues also has always been to work across disabilities. So I do not just, and have never just worked in the space of people who had polio or physical disabilities, but rather across the board. And so over the years, I have learned more about people who have different types of disabilities, because in the beginning, I was really only exposed to people who had certain types of physical disabilities, not even all types. So my experiences have resulted in my being involved in a very rich community here in the United States and internationally. And learning that the discrimination that we have faced in the US is not just here in the US, but discrimination against disabled people exists around the world. And disabled people around the world are fighting for change, for human rights and civil rights.
Judy, thank you so much. How about we pop on over to Keith? Keith Jones is with us. I think he's with us.
Yes, I'm here.
There you are.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So if you see me doing a 3D effect, getting really close and then really far, it's because I'm using my nose to manipulate the mute button. My name is Keith Jones. I am a disability rights advocate by happenstance, African-American male, born in the end of the 60s in St. Louis, Missouri. Really briefly, was one of the first batches of 766 children and 504 children in upstate New York. Go Brooklyn, shout out to Brooklyn. My grandparents are from Brooklyn. And so the journey has always been, I've always been the first or the only person with a disability or the only person of color with a disability. or just the only anything. This journey has come because in spaces, it was a little more complicated. So it wasn't just I couldn't physically get in. Socially, we were certainly precluded from particular areas. St. Louis being in part of Missouri, which by definition was one of the northernmost Confederate states, it still had that history, had that lineage. So going from St. Louis to upstate New York in the mid-70s, right at the beginning of inclusion, or what they used to call mainstreaming, the spaces were always, well, this nice, but Keith, because of the way you walk or because you use a wheelchair, this space isn't safe. It became an issue of liability. Thinking 40 years later, you would think people would have evolved, but that's so not the case. So the reason this is important is because how do you protest? How do you talk about Black Lives Matter if you're in Ferguson, Missouri, and which is where originally I had lived, and you want to protest? How can you do that if there's no curb cuts? And even when you want to gather, those spaces are not conducive to disability inclusion or social justice inclusion for the disability community. So those are some of the reasons that have led me to this kind of work, and making sure that we can bring the discussion broader so that people can GOTV or exercise your right to free assembly or right to free speech. Those things seem to be not really conducive to us if you have a mobility impairment, a sensory impairment, visual impairment, language, what have you, unless we can think about our spaces being universally designed and conducive to being inclusive of all humanity, no matter where they fall on the continuum.
Appreciate that so much, Keith. Thank you so much for being with us as well. It's really so nice every time I see you, Keith, because Keith and I ironically met at an airport when there was ground stops and we were in line together. And he was like a triple gold bazillion medallion member, so he was able to hop on another plane. And poor Karen, she had to spend the night in, I can't even remember what, Wisconsin airport somewhere in the middle of nowhere. And but I think the universe speaks to us so loudly, and it was such an amazing moment to meet you and find out that you're one of the co-founders of Crip Hop Nation, which I know you're going to talk about a little bit later, because I am such a stalker fan, and I would love for our audience to know just what that all represents, you and Leroy Moore. Anyway, so let's pop on over to Mia. Just unmute. Yeah, you got it.
Hello. Hey, how are you all? My name is Mia. Mia Ives Rubley. I am a transracial adoptee with a disability. I am probably one of the youngest on this panel. I am what you call I am one of the what you would call the ADA generation. So my generation, a lot of us were born with the ADA basically already in place by the time we got into school. So I was in kindergarten when the ADA came about, and due to the amazing work of people like Judy Human, so I was born abroad. I was born in South Korea. Was adopted by two white parents. Most of my family is white. I do have one brother that is from Ethiopia. But I basically grew up in a pretty white-centric culture. My neighborhood, I grew up in a middle-class neighborhood, went to schools that were mostly white. I was also usually one of the very few people of color in my classes, and the only person with a disability in my classes. I actually grew up with a learning disability, had to deal with that trying to get accommodations through the IDEA, making sure that I got extra time on my tests and on my homework and stuff. And it wasn't until middle school that I was able to sort of catch up with a lot of my classmates and get into honors courses, and graduated with a pretty high GPA. Went to the University of Illinois, go Illini. Was a part of wheelchair athletics as well. Did it all through middle school and high school, and decided to go to the University of Illinois because it had a varsity wheelchair track team. And went there, got my sociology degree, graduated with honors and cum laude, and went to social work school for my master's degree. I went to the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and got my master's degree. Studied actually mental health issues. And you know, I grew up in a family that was very much a pretty progressive family that always talked to me about needing to speak up for myself and to make sure that I had the services and the supports in place to make sure that I was successful. My parents would talk to me about sort of like accessibility issues when we would run into issues around that, and they would, you know, talk to the owners and stuff like that. And so they were very much my models for advocacy work. And it's part of the reason why I wanted to go into social work in the first place. So I actually became a vocational rehabilitation counselor at the Division of Vocational Rehabilitation, where I worked with people with mental health disabilities to help them find employment within their communities. And then also not just employment, because while employment is like a part of their lives, there's so many other factors that were affecting their lives that made it difficult for people to obtain employment. And so my job was to really look at like every aspect of their life and see how we could work on supports, whether they were natural supports in the community or whether we had to connect them with other supports. That was my job as a vocational counselor. I went after 6 years as a vocational counselor, I went and into research where I was studying the effects of policing and mental health. So talking about how first responders interact with people with mental health disabilities. So we were studying policies and procedures and working with police to better facilitate this interaction between police and the disability community. After a couple of years there, I actually got involved in the Women's March. It was sort of I sort of jumped in to the deep end of national advocacy work and activism. After the 2016 elections, I got involved with the Women's March and really saw where there were needs within our community, because I had been to protests before, and really just decided that I had had sort of enough of being excluded out of these mainstream progressive movements. And so talked to people like you, Karen, about developing a caucus and really worked on making sure that the march was as accessible as we could within such a short amount of time. After that, I became employed at the EEOC first I want to say that I am not speaking on behalf of the EEOC, but I did get a job there and am currently working on disability issues when it deals with employment issues. So yeah, that's sort of my history of getting involved.
Oh my gosh. You know, Mia, it's so interesting to me. You're talking about all these accomplishments, which are so large and looming, and you're like 6 years here and 2 years here and 5 years. And I was like, how is Mia? She can't be 45 yet. You know, so I'm so impressed with all the work that you've done already in this short time of your lifespan. And you are the future, and we're so grateful. And we're going to talk a little bit more later about specifically about the Women's March and those accomplishments around inclusion and the event planning piece, because that is a big thing. And we you know, we have a lot of work to do around that, you know, inclusive spaces, and that's pretty much the theme of what we're talking about. So let us shift on over to my dear friend and colleague, Rhonda Raven.
Hi, thanks, Karen. Hi, everyone. I am Rhonda Raven Newhouse, and I am excited to be here and honored to be on this panel with some amazing colleagues. So I kind of perhaps fall between Judy and Mia on the generational spectrum. I was born in 1975. I was born as a person with a disability, missing both my legs. I wear prosthetic legs and have since I was 13 months old. And I've worn, as I say, I've worn prosthetic legs and my whole life. And so it's all I know. It's what I know. And I was raised and born to advocate for myself, which made it a natural transition to the work and the path that I've chosen in life around disability advocacy. So my mother and my family always taught me that I can do anything. I was also fortunate to have been born a few years before the IDEA Education Act was passed, and I started school in the years just after. And I really think I landed in school in that sweet spot between having a law and having it be litigious, or having school systems even know what they need to do or how to do it. But it ended up being an easy transition for me somehow, which I later in life became well aware of, that it wasn't as such for everybody. But I feel very fortunate that I went to public school my whole life and was included. Things like gym and things that needed to be accommodated were. They were substituted out or accommodated. So I started my career doing environmental work, international and environmental policy and development work. And early on, I started traveling and working in college and just passed, and I was doing international work on turtle conservation and economic development in the Amazon and other things in the world. And very quickly, I'm from Long Island. I grew up on Long Island in New York, near Judy. And I really came into the disability movement through the international backdoor. At 17, I started working internationally, and all of a sudden I'm being pulled into people's homes to meet their family members who have disabilities, who either didn't have a wheelchair or legs or didn't leave their home, or I'm hearing kids don't go to school. And I was 17 and 18 and 20, and I was really confused by that. I was immediately drawn into the disability movement and started advocating for disability inclusion on the environmental and economic development projects that I was working on. So if we were working with children or women, I was like, what about women with disabilities? What about children with disabilities, et cetera, et cetera? And why aren't our meeting spaces accessible? It just sort of came naturally. So my undergraduate degree is in environmental policy and international relations. I then went into a master's degree in sustainable international development at Brandeis University, where I got some of this experience and really shifted my focus into disability rights and development and inclusive development. And then I just got lucky. I was working at Oxfam America, and I was talking about disability inclusion with everything, with gender, with refugees, with every aspect of development work there. And the director connected me with Susan Siegel, who's the director of MyUSA. And he said, you're talking about what she's talking about, and she's talking about what you're talking about, and you have to work for her. And I ended up going on a professional delegation to Japan, my first cross-disability experience in 1998, and immediately thereafter was hired by MyUSA. And that just kickstarted my career. I worked at MyUSA for years. I went to law school in interim years. I worked back at my master's program at Brandeis, and then had two positions that I just want to highlight, because there's a lot I can highlight, but just to keep it efficient here. One was working for Handicap International, now Humanity and Inclusion, HI, and I started and managed the Making It Work initiative, which is working and still is working to effectively implement the CRPD globally using good practices, using the things that work. We all know violations. We all know all that doesn't work. There's so much constantly on our agendas. But to utilize good practices and the things that are working, to be able to replicate them and use them and create effective change that way in implementation of the CRPD, which is an amazing treaty that we have at our disposal as a tool. And then the other position that I held until a couple of years ago was running and heading the DC office of DREDF, the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund, where I was blessed to work with and have as colleagues the very people who helped to write, pass, and sponsor and advocate for the laws that allowed me to have a public school education and that allowed me to have the services, the legs, and the access that I have in my life. And my mentors through DREDF, Judy, Pat Wright, so many other people who really were the founders of the movement. I feel extraordinarily blessed to have had and then been able to work and do civil rights advocacy and lobbying work and policy work with DREDF for many years in DC. And in the last few years, I left DREDF in 2015, and for the last few years I've been doing consulting work as well as growing my healing practice, which we'll talk about later a little bit, which really complements my work in disability rights. And I hold two big parts of my life, which is me as advocate and me as healer. And it blends. It blends for the advocate. It blends for the individual with the disability, and I'm excited to share it. Everything I do is personal. Everything I do is part of who I am. And I'm just proud to be a part of this community and this panel. Thank you.
Yeah, Rhonda Raven, you're so humble about your accomplishments. I know I have your bio and your CV. It's about 12 pages long, and you are so deeply appreciated. And for the audience, Rhonda and I met, I was playing at the US Open in New York City, and she literally took a break, and she wasn't there to watch wheelchair tennis. And she went and looked down at a court, and she saw a wheelchair tennis player, and that happened to be me. And next thing you know, fast forward the conversation, Rhonda Raven lovingly reminded me of this the other day, that this is how we met, because I couldn't remember. And then she went on to play a little bit of sports, but boy, am I grateful. We are grateful. This entire movement's grateful for your advocacy work and now your healing practice. So with that, I'm going to transition into our first question. Judy, I'm always so in awe of Judy. I could just look at you all day. Judy, so, you know, you have been part of this historic movement since the very beginning. And I literally, I lovingly and respectfully call you the goddess matriarch of the movement. And each time I watch The Power of 504. And I have to say, I watch it a few times a month because it brings me, and I highly encourage anyone in the audience, if you have not watched The Power of 504, it's free on YouTube and there's a link to it. Please, I encourage you to watch it. You know, the 504 reminds me of incredible gratitude for the work that we get to do. And it empowers me personally to continue to do the work because it is so hard. But when I watch that, and I watch all the people who are involved in that movement back in the early 70s, it's incredible the amount of work that you have all done and where we have all gone and where we are going. So I'm deeply appreciative of that. So with that, here's my first question. So I'm going to pose it to the panel. I'm going to ask you first, Judy. So, you know, where do you feel that we, people with disability, the disabled population, have been able to have the strongest impact in traditionally non-disabled spaces? So where do you think our milestones have been to date? You know, where in the historical perspective have you seen the biggest impact in spaces that we have traditionally not been included in?
So I think you're talking about the power of 504. I'd like to move it fast forward and talk a minute about Drunk History 504.
Yes.
Because I think when we look at it from a non-disabled person's perspective, what Drunk History 504 means to me is a number of things. First of all, I never heard of Drunk History. I didn't know what it was, and so when a colleague of ours, Candace, who has a sister who works on Drunk History, Candace is a wheelchair user and a Paralympian, and she was able to get Drunk History to look at doing a piece on 504. So here I learned there's a very big audience of people who watch this really great program that comes on once a week in Comedy Central. The piece itself was great because it's basically all disabled actors with different types of disabilities, racial diversity. It kind of pulls all together a very important message. But I think what was also very powerful for me with that program is, for those of you who watch it and for those of you who don't, they always have 3 different stories. And so the day that Drunk History showed, it started out with a piece on a suffragette. The second piece was on the Selma High School uprising. And the third piece was on 504. So I think the sequences of that program that day were great. And of course, I don't know anything about, there was no evaluation, no pre-post testing, but my sense is if that show would have shown by itself, it wouldn't have had the same audience. So to me, that is a great example of how the general population is learning a little bit more about the disability rights movement in the context of other movements. And so I think that's very important. Other major changes. I mean, I think in answering that question, it almost depends on the type of disability you have. Because if you've got a hidden disability, which maybe is one that's only more recently been really seriously addressed, you know, for example, disabled people with autism or disabled people with learning disabilities, those disabilities are still relatively newly being discussed, 20, 30 years, but that's still new. I would say the physical environment is something that we've seen dramatic changes in. Most people have absolutely no idea of what the physical environment was prior to Section 504 or the Architectural Barriers Act of 1968 or the Americans with Disabilities Act or any of the state laws that have been in place prior to the federal laws. The ugly laws, which are no longer around. And again, most people don't know anything about the ugly laws, but there were laws in basically every state that said if you were ugly or displeasing, that you could be thrown out of wherever you were. Those laws are gone now. So I think other very important issues, as our laws have taken hold, they have been impacting a broader population of the universe of disabled people. And I think what we've seen, if you look from the 60s to today, is a growing disability community, not just by disability, but linguistically, racially, ethnically, etc. I think that's all very, very important, that we really are representative of the community that we really are. And I think for me, those are some of the beginning important changes that have occurred. And I think everyone clearly understands that discrimination against any group of people takes a long time to be eradicated. And I would say in this country, we certainly have not even remotely gotten to where we need to go. And I want to also mention LGBTQ, sorry I didn't include that. But I think, you know, when we look across the board, the voices of people from different communities are really out there. If we look at the work that Keith is doing, I mean, I think the rap work is really powerful because storytelling, and that's what a lot of this is about, is honest, sincere, gut-wrenching storytelling that is not only important for those of us telling our stories, but is important for other people to hear our stories, because our stories are many other people's stories. And the ability for people, but if we look at what's going on now with the Judge Kavanaugh hearings, what's powerful about that is that more people are coming forward and feeling, and I'm not speaking about him in particular, but women, men who've been sexually assaulted, who have not felt like they could come forward and say something. This whole issue of empowerment, the creation of really a new movement in the United States, I think is really what we're hopefully moving towards.
Thank you so much, Judy. Really appreciate that thought-provoking answer. And how about that, Keith? Now, there's a beautiful quote from Judy Heumann. Honest, sincere, gut-wrenching storytelling. I would definitely say that about your work. Can you share with us a bit about your work and share with the audience some of your profound moments in terms of space and where we have traditionally not been included? For the audience, they can't see, you know, you from the neck down.
Right.
You know, if you're willing to share what your disability is and how you navigate your space, that would be great. If you don't, that's great too. But I would love to hear, and I know our audience would love to hear about your work. Sins Invalid, Crip Hop Nation, you know, your work with Leroy, and just the work that's ongoing right now.
All right. Well, thank you, Judy Heumann. It's like getting a praise from like the greatest rock star ever. Thank you very much. The work that we do with Crip Hop is an offshoot of the work that I do. And to set this up for those who can't see below the iPad, I have cerebral palsy. I do walk, but I also use a wheelchair. Hashtag wheelchair user, manual wheelchair user, that hashtag. I forget what it is, but it's close enough. The work, really, the hip hop really is a derivative of just me being, you know, young and being in Brooklyn in '78. Like my first rhyme was written in Bed-Stuy Projects in 1978. So I've been rapping for 40 years. But the reason it was one of those things is because even then, music was always supposed to be the great equalizer. You had talent, you could do what you want. But I kept running into spaces where the older I got, the more serious I wanted to pursue the art, the more the disability became prohibitive. You know, skipping over the fact that New Kids on the Block were sitting in the front row watching me perform, and going on to doing shows with some of the bigger names in hip hop, we kept running into, oh, your music is great, but he's crippled. Or, oh, you're funny, but he's crippled. The spaces were, you know, as a teenager, you want to go to a party, you want to hang out, you want to kick it with your friends. How do you do that if there's no accessibility? How do you do that if, you know, the running joke I tell when I give speeches is, you know, ding dong ditch was cool, but if you have a dead wheelchair, you're not really going to be ditching anything. If you want to cut class on senior ditch day, how do you do it with a teacher's assistant pushing your wheelchair down the hall? You can't turn around and be like, excuse me, can you help me cut class today? They don't, you know, people don't really do that. But the space has always been unique in the fact that the discussion has always been, Keith, do you feel like the challenges or the reason you're getting over is because of your ethnicity or because of your disability? I used to tell people it's a coin toss and the quarter always landed on its edge. It's both. The work and how we do with Crip Hop Nation really, excuse me, sprang out of my disgust in attending the 2004 Democratic National Convention. We were there, we went into the disability caucus, and we sat there for 2 hours and nobody spoke to us. They came in for the last 10 minutes and said, excuse me, we hear your concerns. They showed a video that was really touching. And they said, we're really here for you. And after that, I came out and had a discussion with Ben Affleck. And what really disgusted me was the fact that, again, understanding that at the time, 1 in 5, now the stats is 1 in 4. We are the largest voting bloc in the country. And even still, we are precluded from participating, precluded from being rowdy or, you know, having Gay Pride Month where we marched. We did the first Black HIV/AIDS religious awareness march through Boston in 2002. And the irony was we had a deaf trans individual who was there and she was transitioning and nobody thought about providing communications access. The space that we work in terms of disability in hip hop is that we use the music. The tagline of Crip Hop Nation is that it's more than music. So yes, we'll present the story. One of our new songs is called Life on SSI Dollars. It's like, how do you live with an SSI income and still try to be relevant in a consumer-driven society where people don't see your value? So the spaces that we have to operate in are, we're usually called on at the last minute. Oh, we need to get everybody up to the State House because there's a budget cut. We have always been reactive versus proactive. Oh, Keith, we're having a really cool event. We need you to come. Why? Because I filled a quota. The spaces are never, and this is within the quote, woke, quote, social justice, progressive side where we are still having to fight that battle to get into those spaces. My concern as a father, I have daughters. You know, if my daughters should happen to develop a disability, will they be able to get health services and be able to, and it be accessible? Will somebody actually listen to her if she has a hidden disability? Or does she need to walk in a full body cast in order for somebody to pay attention? So the space, the art really is to prod people into getting uncomfortable and to raise awareness. But the spaces that we do those things in, I mean, we did Harvard, never got invited back. We've yet to be invited. Yeah, we was hella black. But we were like, we took them there. And we never got it, you know, and even now, a decade on into Crip Hop, we've never been invited to a historically Black college or university. Major universities are not interested in discussing disability students or disability policy or how to become inclusive. Living in Boston and being in a city where there's 345 colleges, you know, people with disabilities are like 1.3% of the student population. So the spaces are always contextualized in terms of how people relate to your humanity. I'm really cool when I'm on stage, but once I get off stage, it's, you know, I go from being Keith Jones, the activist, to being the black man in the wheelchair, and all of that comes with it. Police interactions that are negative, assumptions that I was a gang member, which led to me having a disability. So that's why the art and the spaces are critically important to having the dialogue. You know, 7 out of 10 people killed by the police have a disability. So that's why we do Crip Hop.
If I could just say something, following up on what Keith was saying for a second.
Absolutely.
You know, when we look at the issue of diversity and we look at college campuses and the work that many of them are doing, the absence of disability in the discussions of diversity is pronounced. And I think, you know, the points that Keith has been making, and I think the points that we're all making, in some way I talk about it as putting the D disability in diversity. And it really does require that those of us with disabilities and those of us who are supportive of a civil human rights agenda, who are college students, undergraduate, graduate, whatever, faculty, need to really be ensuring that the voices of disabled individuals are a meaningful part of these agendas. I think disability studies is really very important, but it's still pretty marginalized. But thanks a lot, Keith.
Thank you so much. Keith, you're so on point with the HBCUs. It's so obvious to me as a white person that the population is so not represented in so many different spaces. And appreciate all the work that you do and appreciate all the work that Leroy does. And, you know, making people uncomfortable I know isn't what makes me always comfortable, but I know how important it is at times. So speaking of making people uncomfortable, Mia, so Mia, you've been a friend and colleague for a number of years, and I would love for you to talk about the Women's March specifically and what that felt like as literally the sole woman in this movement that was bringing up the issue of event access in an area where, you know, in the overarching movements, the bigger movements, we as people with disabilities have traditionally been forgotten, or we're just not recognized all the time until that one person comes up and knocks on the door and says, hey, what about us? And you were that person, but you took a tremendous amount of action. And we know that politics is, you know, Tip O'Neill, former Speaker of the House, said, all politics are local. So you took on this very large and looming task, and you were able to collaborate, convene, and coalesce thousands of women with disabilities to make the march happen as inclusively as possible. So can you talk a little bit about what that experience was like?
Yeah, I guess I didn't really realize exactly what I was getting into in the beginning. You know, I had, like I said before, I had been involved in other activism, advocacy type events as a participant or as like a volunteer. I remember my first two events that I was in, one was an immigration and labor movement protest. And then the second one was I believe it was trying to get rid of a racist mascot at the University of Illinois, which I will admit we did get rid of him. But you know, like I hadn't been on like a national level event. And, you know, like that was definitely not my intention when I first was trying to get involved in the Women's March. My original intention was to try and get involved in North Carolina with one of the chapter events. to see if I could help with volunteering and organizing people to go up to DC from North Carolina, and had started conversing with them, but hadn't really started anything. And I was looking through the Facebook threads and through other social media threads on the Women's March, and had seen quite a few people asking questions about accessibility concerns, and was noticing that the questions weren't being answered, and that was something that, like, I think a lot of us in the disability community are pretty used to, is like we'll ask questions about accessibility and we won't hear back, or we'll hear back at the very, very end. And having seen what happened during the election, having seen sort of the road that we could be very easily slipping down, I just decided to start contacting people that I knew in the disability community, women that I knew in the disability community, to ask them, are you interested in getting involved in something like this? Are you interested in seeing if we could, collect enough people to really push a progressive movement towards being inclusive? So you were actually one of the first people that I was talking to. There are quite a few other people. Like, I knew you from being a junior in sports. So I knew you from being a little kid, and I just contacted as many people as I knew and was like, hey, are you interested in getting involved and seeing what we can do in terms of making sure that we are put as a priority. And after I got enough people, I think I got 6 or 7 people that said that they were interested in being involved. And I just started sending emails. I looked at the names attached to the Women's March event pages on Facebook and just started emailing. I would probably say I probably emailed more than did more than 20 emails to people throughout the volunteer structure. And finally, somebody contacted me, somebody from Pennsylvania, and they were like, hey, I'm connected with the national organizers, and I'm really interested in making sure that this is accessible. How can we help you? And so, we really started a dialogue, and I was like, look, I'm sick of inclusion being just about accessibility. I'm sick of inclusion just meaning about white inclusion. I wanted to talk about the intersections of, disability and race, disability and sexual orientation, disability and just like gender and all these other intersections. And I wanted to talk to them about how disability just intersects every single issue that they wanted to talk about and that they were protesting. And I really wanted to make sure that disabled people were involved in the organizing and were also people that were on stage. And those were like my main talking points throughout the whole time that I was working with them. And, it was not a smooth process at all. To be truthful, it was definitely a lot of back and forth, a lot of, we'd make progress in one area and then slip back in another. We had people who wanted to be all stars and sort of the work and not being very cooperative within the group, and so that became, a lot of bickering, a lot of issues just to try and work through. But eventually, through trial and error, I was able to sort of move the ball down the road and really start working on making sure that we had speakers on stage that had disabilities and that could talk about disability. We also had, you know, one of the biggest things that actually wasn't talked about in the media, but was one of the biggest achievements probably of the whole work that we did, was that we had certified deaf interpreters on stage, and that didn't come about until the very last minute. It was 11 p.m. and we were like pushing to try and make sure that deaf people were on stage interpreting what was going on stage, because that was very important to have representation throughout the whole organizing, throughout the whole production of the events. And so, you know, I think what I really learned in my work on the Women's March was just like, you know, progress is definitely not linear. There's a lot of zigging and a lot of zagging, and there's a lot of just trying to build trust among people, and trying to slow people down. I think a lot of movement makers are in a rush, and I totally understand, you know, like you want to address the issues because people are suffering, but unfortunately rushing means that we are not including people, especially not including people in the disability community. And so understanding, just trying to build relationships, trying to look at who's not included at the table, and making sure that disabled people are involved in every single step of the way, and really trying to get on the front end of organizing, rather than the back end of, oopsie, we forgot to make this successful. How are we going to find the money to make this successful? And are we inclusive, truly inclusive of the disability community? And so, like, I've been really trying to use my experiences from the Women's March and talk to other organizations about my experiences in working in a large, progressive, fast action network of people, and how we can better include disability issues, and, you know, not just the mainstream disability issues, but like the really nitty-gritty issues of like police violence, about women's reproductive rights, about immigration rights, and really making sure that we're including the most affected people within our community.
You're doing some profound work, Mia, and we deeply appreciate your passion and your commitment. I know that literally over the last 6 months, there have been so many incredible people that I know I myself follow. So I know Candace Cable, shout out to her. She always talks about reframing. You know, we always say nothing about us without us, but it's truly nothing without us is essentially what you're saying. I think essentially what the entire panel is saying. You know, at every single level, we need to recognize and we need to invite inclusion, because if it's done on the front end, we don't have to worry about it on the back end. And then we're not always seeming like we have to disrupt all the time. So it's right at the beginning. It's thought about in this universal process. And I appreciate deeply what you talked about, reproductive rights. And at every level of the concerns of a citizen, and even not citizens. So we've got a lot of work to do. So I want to also talk about, we've had a lot of leaders in all of our movements. And, you know, their guidance, power, insight, discernment. And I follow a lot of people on social media, and I also want to just throw their names out there, because our audience, and we'll provide a list later, needs to know who these very profound leaders are in our respective disability rights movement, because disability rights are civil rights, and disability rights and civil rights are human rights, incredibly important. So the likes of Mia Mingus, Leroy Moore, Alice Wong, and believe me, this is not an entirely inclusive list. These are people who have profoundly affected my life and the work that we get to do here at Lakeshore Foundation. Alice Wong, Rebecca Coakley, oh my gosh, mind-blowing work. Lawrence Carter Long, old school and profoundly powerful. Vilissa Thompson, my goodness, is she pushing the envelope? Unbelievable and incredibly profound. Dara Baldwin, Imani Barbarin, Emily Ladau, profound writers, Candace Cable, Victor Khaleesi, and one of my all-time favorites, Kate Ulande Barrett. They are very powerful, and if you have the opportunity, seek all of these people out. Look at what they're writing about and what they're talking about, because they're elevating the disabled community in places where we have historically really not been able to participate at all. And so, and those are just a few of the amazingly powerful advocates. And I think each one of us could add 10, 20, 30, 40 people to that list in and of itself, the profound writers and speakers. And I also wanted to address, now this is a panel that is still not inclusive. As you mentioned, as Keith mentioned, and Judy, I want to say that, and I want to recognize that we're still not talking about people who have different types of identifiers, people who are deaf, people who are blind, people who are autistics, people who are deafblind, and those with psychosocial disabilities. They all have incredible power in these spaces, in these open spaces, and we still don't have an inclusive panel. We're moving forward, but it's still not enough. It's still not enough until we have all of the voices represented and all of the intersections. So that being said, Rhonda Raven. So can you share with us, and you've been mentored literally by the very best, Judy Heumann, and you've been an advocate for a long, long time in so many different spaces. And we don't have a lot of time, and I wish we had 10 hours to talk about this. Maybe someday we will. What I learned about you yesterday, you know, I knew you spoke Spanish, but I didn't know you were so fluent that all of your material, everything that you provide in your consultations, your healing work, everything that you do, you can do in Spanish as well. So that's incredibly profound, and I'm grateful for that. So how do you feel we can collaborate with the population, some of whom are in our audience, some of who've never experienced or understood or know anything about disability at all, because we've got a lot of walking advocates that are listening today. So, you know, how do we collaborate with those who only see us in this one dimension? You know, Mia went through this whole list of where we have spaces, Keith, Judy as well, myself included. And so we're often seen as this one-dimensional personality or nebulous something. And, you know, we've talked about literally reframing what the disability rights movement looks like. You know, what does it look like from an internal perspective? You know, you have done work in the healing arts, transcending your advocacy. Can you speak to that?
Sure. I actually want to backtrack, and then I'll answer that question as part of it.
Of course.
This is a critical conversation for the 20 years I've been doing this work, for the 40 plus years that Judy has been doing this work. And now it's still a critical conversation because we are pigeonholed. You know, a couple things that I didn't say earlier was I have a lot of identifiers too. I am an LGBT Jewish woman with a disability, that we all have numerous intersecting identities, whether they're visible or not. And so we all carry the ability to advocate in so many different spheres in the social justice movement, in the civil rights and human rights world. You know, 20 years ago when I started working on inclusive development, we were talking about including people with disabilities at all levels in the development process. And we're still talking about that. And Mia was saying the exact same thing within the Women's March, on all levels, not just people coming to the events, but on the stage, as speakers, as organizers, in the development world, we always, as CEOs and leaders, as staff people, as field staff, as interns, all the way throughout the international development arena. And we can say that for policy in DC as well, that it's not, when you say that we're all kind of pigeonholed in identities, we're pigeonholed in our personal identities, but we're also pigeonholed in where we can land, that people with disabilities are entry level, or people with no, we span everything, and we have the capacity, the education, the knowledge, and the ability to advocate, as you said, Karen, nothing about us without us, for ourselves, and in collaboration with people without disabilities, obviously, for our rights, for what we're doing in this world. And the reason that it's needed now still is because so many spaces and so many forums and so much work is still not accessible. Mia touched on it, but I just want to say, for those of you out there that are not specifically steeped in disability work, to plan for inclusion, to budget for inclusion, for sign language interpreters, for putting materials in alternate formats, to having spaces that are accessible, which are easier now than they used to be, but still, especially if you're working internationally at all. It's so much easier to plan ahead of time and to budget and to organize for inclusion. Retrofitting things and trying to make spaces accessible or do things at the last minute can sometimes work, but they're more expensive, they're more stressful, they're just more of everything in terms of having it done. And then it feels like it's more of an excess amount of work and burden. But if you actually plan for it and you think about it and you work with the disability community in the planning of programs or advocacy or programming, that it isn't as hard, and it isn't as challenging as it may seem at times. It really isn't. And we see rushing just means greater expense and greater harm. And we see this in education in schools. We see this with healthcare, with tables and MRI machines that are not accessible. We see this in transportation and inaccessible transportation systems, and just so many areas in policy, so many areas that affect the lives of people with disabilities throughout in the accessing of our services. So just wanted to touch on that piece. And then, so then bringing that in, we as advocates and we as people with disabilities are constantly fighting, are constantly pushing up against barriers, are constantly pushing up against having to bring disability into the conversation, even when it's not necessarily about disability, having to keep fighting for access and pointing out lack of inclusion. And it's tiring, it's exhausting, it's frustrating, it's stressful. It's just, we all have our spoons and our bandwidth of what we can do in a day or what we can do. And sometimes we have a ton of energy and we can start from scratch. And this goes down to what language is used, disability inclusive language on materials, on promotional materials, in policy, in all areas. It gets exhausting. And then we have, I've worked in coalitions with amazing coalitions of civil rights and human rights advocates, where I'm constantly that voice of like, please include disability. Come on, okay, if something's happening for education or healthcare or, any civil rights issue, what about people with disabilities? What about women with disabilities? It's constantly what's left off the table. I played that niche role both at the international level and the domestic level. At the same time, there are disability communities and coalitions where there are various approaches to disability happening at the same time. And I am constantly the voice for the civil rights approach, for the social model of disability, as opposed to maybe seeing people with disabilities through a medical lens or a charity, poor me kind of lens. And so even within coalitions and within spaces that are our spaces, that are civil and human rights and disability community, we're constantly having to speak up to be recognized, seen at the table for both the disability inclusion and the rights approach to disability. Now, given the fact that we're all, that this work can lead to exhaustion and stress and anger at times, and grief at times when we're just not seen or just not recognized, and really just especially these days, although I'm sure it's always been this way, but now it feels like it's just heavier, bombarded with so much in the news and in politics and in, in the world right now. We need to take care of ourselves. And this is where the crossover piece happens, because I know this from personal experience. Everything I do, I speak from my own lived experience, but it's so important to take care of ourselves as advocates. Not in a caring, oh, we need to like take care of people, but we need to take care of ourselves in a very empowered way. And be able to be healthy in this arena, because I know I want a career that lasts my entire life. And I've, had illnesses and had things that have taken me out due to stress and due to overwhelm and autoimmune stuff that I would love to not to support others in not having to have. And that led me to starting a piece of my healing practice that overlaps with my disability rights consulting work, and that is around self-care and healing for the advocate. How do we have tools for our own maintenance, for our own self-care, for our own ability to be present and grounded and clear and not as exhausted and not completely burned out, although we will always spend a lot of time and energy doing the work that we do. But how do we do this for ourselves so that we can then keep doing the work that we're doing in the world and keep being effective and keep being the leaders that we are and the voices that we are without burning out or having to stop and that's going to be different on a different each day and on a daily basis. But this is the piece that I'm working on right now, both in workshops and individual sessions with clients, with individual people on, okay, what is going on for you? What is going on in your life right now that is needing to be looked at and needing to be addressed? Some of the things that, let's see, that are coming up right now. Judy mentioned Kavanaugh and the Me Too movement and the why I did not report. I know from a personal and professional place around this that we keep getting re-traumatized by things that are happening in politics, in the news, in our world right now. And if there are survivors or there are, everything that happens will trigger different people. And then it's hard if we're triggered to do the advocacy work that we need to do and be clear and well rested and able to do what we need and are doing in the world. And so, we see kids in cages, we see racism, we see and experience fake news, and all just constantly being barraged and bombarded with these national traumas that affect us personally. So the tools that I'm, that I work with are about refilling our cup. How do we remove the blockages to our own things that need healing from our pasts so that we could be more free and clearer and better able to listen to ourselves and our own needs first so that we can take care of others. I always say, like, it's such a simple metaphor, but put your oxygen mask on before you put it on your children in a plane. It's the same kind of thing. Like, we need to take care of ourselves and our own pain and our own triggers and our own traumas and our own stuff from our past before we can do it for others, but well, we have to do it for ourselves so that we can then be there.
I think I think sessions like this are really important, because the bottom line is everybody in this panel, and for the hundreds of other people that are listening in, I think we've all learned, I can't speak for anybody else, but I think we're on a similar page. One of the ways that we move forward is by getting support from others, that the work that we're doing is relevant, that we're not just speaking for ourselves, but from others. And for me, one of the ways that I continue to be energized is by being with other people and collaborating with other people and moving agendas forward. So, you know, if you look at what Mia's been doing as an example, she started something off by herself, and then she really, she was frustrated and I'm sure pulling her hair out, but you saw promise in what was happening. You reached out to other people. You know, the work that Keith is doing, same thing, you know, the same struggles, but then realizing through the work that he's been doing, also bringing other people in. I think there are many different ways that we need to look at how to empower ourselves individually, and I think knowing what they are and how to address them is really important. For me, at the end of the day, I want people not to feel like they're alone. I want people to recognize that whoever they are, having a disability or being engaged with the movement or family member, whatever, that we want to be able to identify people who have similar goals and objectives, to be able to support each other. You know, so with some of the questions that have been coming in, you know, on employment, as an example, there are a lot of resources that are out. We could do a separate session on issues around employment, but I think, you know, very quick information, putting things up so people know websites that are doing good work on issues around employment, resources that are out there, companies that are doing good work. And I think also being able to know that we are individually not alone. And I think for the millions of disabled people who, for whatever reason, are not identifying or identifying and ashamed of speaking out about who they are. You know, I was laughing when Keith was speaking because we're not the same age. We're not that far apart. And I also studied music, and I was also interested in acting. And I was in Brooklyn, and all the stories that he was telling, why am I laughing? Because we could change our voices and be the same thing. We're not alone. People need to know we're not alone. People need to feel like they can get resources from us. We need to look at different ways that we can healing and moving forward. But at the end of the day, I think everybody's got to commit to being public. You know, you mentioned earlier, Karen, that your language is disabled people, but in your office, you don't use that language. For me, I use my language. I don't let anybody tell me what to call myself. And and I know it's a difficult thing, and language is a little thing, but the bottom line is, to our own selves, we have to be true and support each other to be able to do that.
What a privilege it is to moderate this panel. Judy, thank you so much for that. And Rhonda, absolutely. So we are at, my time 2:17, your time 3:17. So I'm gonna try to move this, like we've got a bunch of questions from people who have been sending their questions in. So I'm gonna start with this one, and this is open to all the panelists, whoever wants to take this one on. So we've got the governor's representative for highway safety in North Carolina, and he's also the director of North Carolina's Governor Highway Safety Program. And he's also a wheelchair user, and he identifies as he. And he wants to know, what can we do on a statewide policy level and a funding level to make a difference in pedestrian safety for those of us with disabilities? I see your nose. I see your nose.
Yes, I just went in 3D. Well, that's the key. It's getting state buy-in and just using my experience in terms of working with the state of Massachusetts. It's really making sure, if you already have a partnership with the state, that's great. But bureaucracy is really good at perpetuating themselves and not making any kind of inroads into what necessarily needs to be done. So one of the ways you can do it is I found that when you broaden out the scope of the discussion in terms of how beneficial it is to everybody else. If you're talking about pedestrian safety, i.e. John Kelly, in terms of the red brick situation in Boston, you know, everybody thought it was a pet peeve, but if you're a woman wearing high heels in the snow, trying to go up to Beacon Hill, looking all cute, and then you get your heel caught on a red brick, you're mad as hell. If you're pushing a stroller and there's no curb cut and you got to tip the baby back, you're mad as hell. If you're a jogger and you're worried about, you know, slanted sidewalks. I mean, there are ways to do this, but it really turns into a marketing campaign about how to. Yes, there's a benefit to the disability community, but there's a benefit to the community as a whole. And what it does do, once you take that approach, it kneecaps the whole, oh, that's so nice, you disabled people want to be part of the community. Okay, we'll make it cool. No, if you talk about it on a policy level and say, okay, if you don't want to be inundated with public requests to fix the sidewalks, then just be proactive. So those are the kind of things, and particularly if you're in North Carolina, you can make it a heritage thing. You know, particularly now after we just got hit with the hurricanes and the flooding, this is the perfect time to approach the state and say, while we are rebuilding, let's take this opportunity to do universal design. Why would we do universal design? We'll do universal design because if we can do it, we can attract more businesses, we can attract more people, and we can have our population stay in place and age in place, thereby making North Carolina the destination place. Those are the kind of tools and tactics I would suggest you try to use, and then see if you can get buy-in from other people within the state so they can understand, one, not just the social benefit, but the economic benefit as well.
I would also highly recommend, we just came off here at Lakeshore Foundation, a 2-day summit on inclusive, healthy communities. And what we did was train walk auditors, and we coalesced. And that was the first day. And then we planned out our routes because we wanted people to get involved. We created inclusive panels. We created inclusive walk audit routes. We created panels that were local. We created panels that were national. We got decision makers, mayors of cities within Alabama. And then we went on actual walk audits. Because sometimes, and yesterday, just for an example, I was with one of our city engineers, and he had no idea, had it not been for the walk audit, of what someone's experience is, and I happen to be a wheelchair user, what that would be like. And we did approximately a mile in our particular neighborhood or our area, and we had 11 groups doing this, and all the groups were diverse, intersectional, and so there was a lot of conversation. And what were we going to do proactively to solve these problems? Because we did them as a community. It wasn't just the people with disabilities, the people who are Black, the people who are white. It was all people within a group, and so they all had perspective, and it was very, very successful. I know that if you reach out to America Walks, they have an entire grant cycle happening right now. Make that happen, and I think I would love to extend that to all the communities, all the people that are listening. So I know we're super short on time. The panel, can you give us in maybe 1 or 2 sentences something around your own calls to action for the people within our audience? Let's start with you. Keith, since you're right here, let's start with you.
2 sentences. The call to action, let's try to be quick. The call to action would be to form coalitions and really understand the intersectionality across disability, across culture. Understand that when you do make the call, try to get out of your own head and understand that depending on what your cultural backdrop, your history, your gender, or your orientation, disability is viewed in a very particular way, and to allow people to self-identify and to self-describe what makes them part of the community.
Wonderful. Rhonda?
Okay, very quickly, just that we're all in this together, that we're all committed to justice, we're all committed to equality, we're all committed to hopefully inclusion, and that we need to not be fractured, that it's important to work together to make this happen, to ask the questions that are hard to ask or that we think are stupid or silly, you know, and get the information that we need, not don't do it because it's hard or because you don't have the information. The information is out there. There are resources out there. Also that disability is a civil right and inclusion isn't scary. And finally, to look within ourselves to see what change we're making and what we need, like community, and this community is amazing.
Mia, are you still with us? I don't know. She may have dropped off. So
Hey.
Judy?
No, I'm here.
Oh, you're here. You're here. Okay, right on.
Yeah. My biggest thing that I would say is be comfortable with being uncomfortable. So in a way that it's okay to have some divisiveness, it's okay to have some friction, because that means that you all are trying to discuss the most salient issues within your communities, and that groups feel comfortable enough to talk to each other about those salient issues. So really being okay with being uncomfortable is the biggest thing that I learned through my work. And then also to really build sort of a line of people that you can work with, that you are building up in terms of like mentoring, and to really just be as inclusive as possible. If there's a group of people that you know are not at the table, then try and go to their events, build relationships, and then invite them to the table.
Thank you, Mia. Judy.
Carrying forward on what people have been saying, I think it's speak up, speak out, speak loud. I had a friend, and when I would be doing work sometimes with non-disabled people and things were weird, I would call her up and say, "Am I a Martian?" Because sometimes I really felt like the way people were looking at me and not talking with me or talking with me was very disingenuous. So it was always important, and is always important for me to be working in a group and getting support from others. I think exactly as Mia was saying, get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And to expand on that a little bit, which is exactly, I think, what everybody in this group has done, it's taking an idea that you believe other people will be resistant to, not necessarily disabled people, but non-disabled people. As she said, feel comfortable, also have solutions. I think it's very important, as Mia was doing, and it's, everybody here has been doing, not just come forward and say, this is a problem, but this is a problem and these are solutions.
Mm-hmm.
And they can be individual solutions, but I think, as we've all been saying, the ability to have more than one person discussing these solutions is not only important for you as an individual, but it's also important for people to understand that we represent more than one individual person. And I think another issue is really using the media much more effectively. I think we do not use the media effectively because our voices are still too individualized, and because we have so many things on our plate. But I think we need to look at models like the GLAD model and others, where one of the ways that media began to represent this LGBTQ issues more effectively was by targeting, organizing, putting things out, becoming more acquainted with the media, and the media recognizing that if people were not listening to criticism, there would be an adverse effect to that.
That was huge. All right, did we get everybody? Did I get everybody? Yes, 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 yes. Wow.
I don't think Rhonda gave a
Did
2-minute.
Oh, there's Kate Kraft. I hear you. Rhonda, did you speak? I can't. Did you give it?
I did.
You did.
I
thought
did.
so.
Yeah.
Okay, so I just wanted
You
to.
did? Okay.
Okay, so I'm trusting that our audience has a bigger and better perspective of what we're trying to convey. And I know I'm saying what we are trying to convey, and that's just this small group that represents so many other people, because there's so many other people that need to be represented in this space. And I'm trusting that the awareness is just going to continue with what you have all offered. I know that diversity is sometimes really tough to understand, but just like Judy Heumann said, speak up, speak out, and speak loud. I can't tell you how much I appreciate that. just personally and professionally. And the entire panel, you're all so profound, and I'm grateful personally and professionally for your time in this space. So I want to thank you. I want to thank Charles Brown for creating this series for America Walks. I want to thank America Walks, specifically Kate and Heidi. Definite gratitude for our live cart provider, Donna. Thank you so much, Donna, with ACS Captions. That's captionfamily.com. To everyone in attendance, for the gift of your incredible attention. We're going to be providing a list afterwards. This webinar is also recorded, so you can share it with your friends and family. I know that Kate, are you still with us? I know you wanted to have a little something.
I am here. This is definitely an unscripted part of this, but I did want to just come on and thank all of you. An incredible conversation and discussion. There were so many salient points made that I'm sure everyone who listened is taking home some transformative information. So Karen, Judy, Mia, Rhonda, Keith, thank you so much. I hope this is the first of many such conversations we can have together.
Thank you so much, Kate. And I also want to say thank you to Lakeshore Foundation for providing the space and the opportunity for all of us to have this conversation. And thank you, everybody, and make it a really perfect day. Bye.
Bye.